Thank you for your patience. It's great to have such a large and enthusiastic crowd here for the 2005 to 2006 Colin O'Fallon Lecture in Law and American Culture. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center, and I am going to introduce the introducer, who is Professor Jim O'Fallon, who most of you know well. I just want to make a couple of comments. One is to remind you that there will be a book sale and a signing and a reception following the lecture, so there'll be time to continue the question and answer period more informally. And then there's also a literature table about the Oregon Humanities Center, also where the reception is. There'll be envelopes there. If you are interested in having events like this continue in the future, you can help us out. And there's also be information on upcoming Oregon Humanities Center events. So Professor Jim O'Fallon.
Thank you. This is the time each year when I get to show my students, if they show up, that I do in fact own a coat and tie. Other than that, I believe that your presence tonight shows something that we very much wanted, and that is that this has become a part of the community. This is the 19th year of this lecture. Excuse me. This evening we are graced by Richard Thompson Ford of the Stanford Law Faculty, a native of San Francisco, did his undergraduate work all too recently at Stanford, his law degree even more recently at Harvard, I believe graduated in 1991. So that's a law school colleague of a member of our faculty, Keith Aoki. Richard worked as a housing policy consultant in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then a litigation associate with the Morrison and Forster firm in San Francisco. So he got a little bit of a taste of big-time legal practice. Thought better of it. Took a Reginald Lewis Fellowship at Harvard, which is a very distinguished opportunity to develop public interest capacities as a young graduate student, and went from there to join the Stanford faculty in 1994, where he now holds the Georgie Osborne professorship. And for those who have a little bit of connection with Stanford, Osborne was himself a legendary figure on the Stanford faculty. Part of the legend is a story that he berated one particular class in mortgages that he had back in the early 50s as the most incompetent, incapable group of people he had ever taught in his life, two of whom ended up on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now that may be just apocryphal, but it's such a good story that it's going to continue forever. Richard's areas of expertise include anti-discrimination law, civil rights law, race relations, local government, urban issues, housing law, democratic theory, and institutions. The book that he is speaking from tonight, one of the blurbs on the dust jacket from Janet Haley at Harvard describes it as elegant, clear, and argumentatively tough. Terms that I would agree with, having read the book, but also I have to credit him for knowing how to pick a blurber. I mean, that's good stuff. Before I bring Richard forward, I do want to acknowledge the role that the Humanities Center has had in sustaining these lectures over the years. Steve, Julia Hayden, the Associate Director of the Center, Ruth Ann McGuire, who does all the hard work, the heavy lifting of the organization of the program. the wedding together of the law and American culture, art and American culture themes of this lecture couldn't have had a better home than the Oregon Humanities Center. And I will enthusiastically endorse Steve's pitch for any help that people want to give them to support the ongoing program. Well, it is now time to sit back and listen to Richard Thompson Ford talk to us about racial culture, a critique. Richard?
Thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Humanities Center for inviting me here today. So the following is an excerpt from the opinion in 1980 of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Plaintiff is a black woman who seeks $10,000 damages, injunctive, and declaratory relief against enforcement of a grooming policy of the defendant American Airlines that prohibits employees in certain employment categories from wearing an all-braided hairstyle. She alleges that the policy violates her rights under the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution and under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, in that it discriminates against her as a woman and more specifically as a black woman. Plaintiff asserts that the cornrow style has a special significance for black women. She contends that it has been historically a fashion and style adopted by black women, reflective of the cultural and historical essence of black women in American society. The style was popularized, so to speak, within the larger society when Cicely Tyson adopted the same for an appearance nationally viewed on the Academy Awards presentation several years ago. This was written in 1980. It was and is analogous to the public statement by the late Malcolm X regarding the Afro hairstyle. At bottom line, the braided hairstyle, sometimes referred to as cornrows, has been and continues to be part of the cultural and historical essence of black women. So that's plaintiff's claim. Renee Rogers, the plaintiff in the case, lost, but it's actually long been considered an easy case for anti-racists on the political left of the ideological spectrum. A large and personal, uptight corporation versus a proletarian underdog whose deeply personal mode of self-expression is also the embodiment of the soul of a subject people. Milquetoast versus multiculturalism, bureaucracy versus braids. We know which side we're on. But I'd like to suggest the case isn't as easy or shouldn't be as easy for the left as it may initially seem or as it has seemed to a lot of commentators. In fact, it raises some tough questions for racial politics and for anti-discrimination law. First, let's clarify her claim. We'll notice first that Rogers didn't argue that the employer banned braids in a deliberate attempt to deter black women from applying for the positions. In other words, she's not claiming that the employer used braids as a proxy in order to screen out black women. If it had, she may well have had a strong claim for intentional discrimination, but that wasn't her claim. The facts don't support the claim, and Rogers didn't advance it. Instead, she argues that a grooming rule that includes a prohibition on braids, and it's worth noting that airlines like American Airlines had quite elaborate grooming codes that prohibited a whole range of styles. This wasn't a prohibition against braids and braids alone. It was a prohibition that regulated all sorts of things, virtually every aspect of the way employees presented themselves in the airline industry at this time was regulated. She argues that the grooming rule that includes a prohibition on braids is by virtue of that alone race discrimination, regardless of the employer's intent. So her claim rests on the argument stated in the excerpt I just mentioned. Cornrows are the cultural and historical essence of black American women. I want to explore this idea. More generally, I want to explore the idea that culture is the essence of racial difference, that races come bundled with cultures, something called cultures attached, and so that discrimination against the cultural practice of the race is race discrimination. That's basically Rogers' claim, and it's a claim that's been advanced by a lot of people in the legal literature. Discrimination on the basis of black culture is the same as discrimination on the basis of dark skin. Rogers' own pleadings assert that the hairstyle was popularized in the 1970s. So already we have some questions, a historical essence that started after the Vietnam War. And if the style was popularized by a Hollywood actress, Cicely Tyson, then how different is it from, say, the coif that Farrah Fawcett made famous at roughly the same period of time, a hairstyle that the airlines also would have prohibited at that period of time. They had fairly strict rules about how long hair could be, for instance. It had to be tied up in buns. We might begin by asking that, but of course Rogers' claim is that braids, unlike Farrah's feathered hairstyle, made a political statement of racial pride. Rogers' briefs evoke Malcolm X, for instance, in support of the political importance of the cornrow hairstyle for blacks. So should this give her a legal right to it? Suppose some black women employed by American Airlines wish to wear cornrows and advance the political message it ostensibly embodied, while others thought cornrows and that political statement damaged the interest of blacks and black women in particular and reflected badly on the race as a whole. Given the cultural politics of black America in the mid to late 70s, when this case would have begun, there almost certainly were such black women employed by American Airlines, and even more certainly there were such black women among its customers. And it's likely that the management of American Airlines sought out and considered the opinions of its employees and customers when it made its grooming policies and made them based at least in part on such information. So now Rogers' claim is no longer plausibly described as a claim on behalf of black women. Instead, it's a claim on behalf of some black women over the possible objections of others. Now, Rogers and her supporters might object, well, what business is it of other black women whether we wear braids? No one's going to be forced to wear them. But this individualistic account of the stakes is just inconsistent with the proffered rationale for protecting the hairstyle as a legal right, that cornrows are the cultural essence, not of one black woman, but of black women as a group. If this claim is to be taken seriously, then cornrows cannot be the cultural essence only of those black women who choose to wear them. They have to be the cultural essence of all black women. And in this case, all black women have a stake in the rights claim and the message that it will necessarily send about them. Not only those who support the statement, but also those who oppose the statement conveyed by cornrows. So even if we take it on faith that cornrows represent, let's say, black nationalist pride as against the integrationist or assimilationist style of, let's say, chemically straightened hair, it's still clear that a right to cornrows would be an intervention in a long-standing debate among African Americans about empowerment strategies and norms of identity and identification. And for the black women who disliked cornrows and the political statement that they sent and wished that no one would wear them, the right not only hinders her and deprives her of allies, it also adds insult to injury by proclaiming that cornrows are her cultural essence as a black woman as well. There are also implications for people who aren't members of the protected group, but who want access to the cultural style and artifacts that the rights regime would tie discursively to a particular group. The Rogers case implicates, then, that increasingly common resident of college campuses and urban centers, the dreadlock blonde. Most obviously, Rogers' theory of the case implied that a black woman who wished to adopt the braided hairstyle would have a right to do so while, say, a white woman who wished to emulate Bo Derek's hairstyle, or Cicely Tyson's hairstyle, or Bob Marley's hairstyle for that matter, would not have such a right, it not being their cultural essence after all. Of course, one might say that the Bo Dereks of the world would be no worse off if Rogers had won her case. They'd have the same limited opportunities to wear braids as they had before the litigation. But this isn't quite so. If an all-braided style is the cultural essence of black women as a matter of law, mightn't this also imply that Ms. Derek and her emulators are black-coiffed, if not black-faced, minstrels, or white Negro wannabes? It's likely that a right premised on the immutable link between blacks and braids would discourage white and Asian women from wearing braids by sending the message that the hairstyle belongs to another racial group. And while right to cornrows might seem only to enhance the freedom of potential cornrow wearers, then it's arguably better described, perhaps better described, as a policy of segregation through which a set of grooming styles are reserved for a particular group. Rogers' favorite outcome in the case would then likely have two consequences. One, it would almost certainly increase the number of black women wearing cornrows, both because employers would no longer be able to forbid them to wear them, and also because the judicial embrace of Rogers' theory of the case would encourage black women to identify cornrows as their cultural essence and thereby popularize the style. And it's this latter idea that I want to spend some time focusing on in a moment. And two, it would also likely reduce the number of non-black women wearing the style, as those women would also internalize the legally disseminated message that the hairstyle was the cultural property of another group, black women, and conclude that their adoption of the style would be inauthentic or even a type of cultural trespass. So the result would be an increased divergence along racial lines in women's grooming. The stereotypical assimilationist would, of course, find this distressing, but perhaps so should the type of multiculturalist who believes that groups of differing racial, social, and cultural backgrounds should freely mix and exchange and interchange ideas and aesthetic conventions. Finally, even for the black women who affiliate with the cornrow hairstyle, those who agree with Renee Rogers, this type of legal enforcement comes with hidden costs. Most disquietingly, the possibility that the cultural rationale could set precedent that might apply in other cases. In fact, it almost certainly will. It should if Renee Rogers is right. Hair may seem relatively trivial, but if braids are the immutable cultural essence of black women, what else is? There are a lot of possible answers to this question, some disturbing, and that many people will find as intuitively plausible as Rogers' assertion regarding braids. So consider for a moment another case in which an employer's policy implicates a theory of racial difference. And I quote again from a different court. TPG, or the Parker Group, is a telephone marketing corporation often hired to perform work for political candidates. The conduct at issue in this case involves TPG's work making get-out-the-vote calls for various political candidates. Approximately 10% of such calling is race-matched, such that black voters are called by black TPG employees who use a black script, while white voters are called by white TPG employees who use a different white script. So you get the basic idea when they write scripts in order to target a particular racial demographic, and then they assign the scripts to people of that race. But it gets better or worse. TPG employees doing the race match calling were assigned separate calling areas and separate scripts according to race, and TPG also physically segregated employees who worked at race matched calling. Black callers were segregated into one room and white callers into another. Is TPG's policy, as the court ultimately held, racially discriminatory because it's based on a racial stereotype that blacks would respond to blacks and that race was directly related to their ability to do the job? Or is the policy the natural outgrowth of the recognition of cultural differences between the races and therefore justifiable and perhaps even commendable? If Rogers' cultural essence is a black woman gives her an intrinsic relationship to a hairstyle, mightn't even a good faith employer conclude that her cultural essence would also enable her better to persuade other blacks and disable her from connecting with whites? The logic and assumptions underlying both Rogers' claim and the Parker Group's policy are strikingly similar. Both assume that an ascriptive social identity, in this case race, corresponds to a substantive and intrinsic characteristic, culture. Both insist that this correspondence should have legal consequences for the organization of the workplace. Both Rogers' rights claim and TPG's policy are informed by a thick account of the cultural entailments of group identity. They assume that races come with cultures attached. They assume the existence and salience of what I will call racial culture. So the theory of racial culture informs a demand that's now common in the legal scholarship, although so far rejected by most courts, the demand that discrimination on the basis of culture be treated as discrimination on the basis of race, in other words, prohibited. I think this demand is problematic because it proceeds from an oversimplified conception of culture and an inadequate conception of social power. I fear that if the legal multiculturalists get their way, we'd suffer several unintended side effects. One, we'd promote destructive racial stereotypes. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. Two, we'd control and limit the ways that we can think about race. And worst of all, we'd control the way racial minorities, people of color, can think about their own identities. And three, we'd exacerbate what I think is an unfortunate focus on symbolism in matters of racial difference and further distract attention away from more pressing issues of racial justice and economic equity. So first, the inadequate conception of power. The call for rights to cultural difference offers a familiar story about the way race and racism work. Okay. And it goes like this. Ever since the limited but decisive victory of the American Civil Rights Movement, racism, daunted but not defeated, has sought a new front from which to attack. And the same principles that successfully made the bigots of 1950s eat Jim Crow have also been deployed against analogous prejudices, sexism, homophobia, ageism. But these bigotries, too, have retreated only to regroup and fight another day on another battlefield with new and as yet undiscovered weapons of mass discrimination. We have it on good authority from reliable sources of intelligence that one of the most potent of these new weapons is a covert form of discrimination that functions by misdirection. Bigotry will now target not groups, but their distinctive practices. The law will not countenance discrimination against blacks, but bigots can stigmatize Ebonics. One wouldn't dare discriminate against women, but chauvinists can repress distinctively feminine styles of social interaction. The result, a new bigotry not of types of people, but of ways of being, of modes of acting. Now, to be clear, the goal of the new bigotry is subtly different from that of the old bigotry on this account. The goal is not necessarily to exclude the previously stigmatized people through use of proxies. The idea is not, for instance, to screen out blacks by punishing black speech patterns. Instead, the goal is to transform the previously stigmatized groups to remake them in the image of the majority. And the ultimate goal on this account is arguably even more vicious and more comprehensive than simple exclusion. It's what black nationalists used to call bloodless extermination or cultural genocide. The story is familiar not only because it's been told so often, but also because it's a type of story that has an archetype. The story of the new bigotry is a story of repression. The authentic cultural practices of groups are being repressed, and that's the way power is working, by repressing. It's this archetype, the archetype of the repressive hypothesis involves not culture but sexuality. It's what Michel Foucault, in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, called the repressive hypothesis. So, a divergence for a moment into the terrain of sexuality to give you an idea of why the conception of power that I've just articulated is inadequate. This is what Foucault argued. Foucault argued against the familiar story in which the institutions of bourgeois society from the Victorian era to the present have operated to repress the natural and authentic sexuality of individuals. This is the repressive hypothesis. Probably sounds familiar if you read anything about sex in the last several decades. Instead, Foucault argued that the Victorians were, as we their heirs are still today, obsessed with sexuality. They didn't repress it. They saw it everywhere. They constantly discussed it. They insisted on its relevance. They deployed it as a description of many divergent forms of human behavior. They produced sexuality by defining human behavior in terms of sexuality, defining individuals as sexed in various ways, and cataloging and constructing sexual typologies. Far from repression, it was this production of sexuality, according to Foucault, that defines the modern attitude toward sex. Notably for Foucault, the homosexual, the latest in a long line of political identities, was invented in this process, where before you had isolated sexual acts, sodomy, buggery, what have you, now these acts became understood as symptoms of a sexual personality type, and this was new. This was the result of this production of sexuality that Foucault's describing in the Victorian era. To be sure, before the Victorian production of sexuality, these acts were often stigmatized, but it was the acts that were stigmatized, not the people as such. So the idea that people have a sexual orientation, that they have sexuality and fall into various sexual types, that's a new idea. That's the production of sexuality. This production of sexuality was also a means of control, according to Foucault. It was and is a technology that defined the self according to its sexuality and thereby kept individuals under a type of sexual surveillance. And if anything repressed authentic eroticism, a term whose ontological status is for Foucault questionable at best, but if anything repressed it, it was the incessant production of sexuality that limited the possibilities of erotic expression by imposing upon individual eroticism a narrow universe of sexual types. Finally, Foucault argued that the repressive hypothesis was not only inadequate, he also usefully insisted that the very idea that sexuality is repressed demands interrogation in its own right. And this passage is so good it deserves to be quoted verbatim. So he says, "The question I would like to pose is not why are we repressed, but rather, why do we say, with so much passion and with so much resentment against our recent past, against our present, and against ourselves, that we are repressed? What has led us to show ostentatiously that sex is something we hide, and to do all this by formulating the matter in its most explicit terms, by trying to reveal it in its most naked reality? We must also ask why we burden ourselves today with so much guilt for having made sex a sin. How to account for the displacement which, while claiming to free us from the sinful nature of sex, taxes us with a great historical wrong which consists precisely in imagining that nature to be blameworthy." So there's a displacement. We claim that we're worried about repression, and we're actually reducing a different kind of social power by fretting about repression. And it's a way of actually talking more and more about the thing that we're claiming we're repressing. So Foucault suggests the repressive hypothesis is itself an instrument for the production of sexuality. The complaint that sexuality is repressed is really a way of obsessing over it all the more, and a way of making the interrogation of sex a moral imperative. Far from a diagnosis that could free us from coercive power, the repressive hypothesis is a means of continuing an obsessive and prescription interrogation of sexuality. So now we find that in order to avoid the ever-present risk of repression, we must all have healthy sex lives that include a minimum and maximum number of copulations per week. Too few, and you're repressed. Too many, and you're a sex addict. They must be performed in the correct state of mind, no fantasizing about someone else, and with proper reverence. Remember, foreplay, boys. No cheap quickies, please. But not too much reverence. If you're too uptight about the whole thing, you have to loosen up. Plan to be impulsive. Try a quick bang now and again. But I digress. Now let's turn to culture. So the implicit presumption underlying the new bigotry account that I advanced a moment ago is that group cultural differences are natural and authentic, and failure to respect those differences is a form of repression. Here again is the repressive hypothesis. Power is exercised through censorship and repression, and justice entails nothing more than the absence of repression, a willingness to let human nature take its natural course. But suppose, Pace Foucault, our area is defined not, or at least not only, by the repression of group difference, but also by its production. Suppose the repressive hypothesis is one of the mechanisms by which this production of group difference is achieved in this context as well. We live in a society in which human beings are sorted and sort themselves with remarkable comprehensiveness, precision, and efficiency into a number of almost canonical social groups. You know what they are, and more importantly, you know who you are. So think about the neighborhood magazine kiosk where the godfather of identity niche marketing, Ebony Magazine, competes for space now with Essence for black women, Latina, self-explanatory, Yolk for Asian Americans, get it? Out for gays and lesbians. Consider cable TV, where black entertainment TV shares the dial now with a growing number of identity-oriented television stations and lineups, featuring ethnically targeted advertising and ethnic variations on the same staples of primetime TV, the family sitcom, and the crime drama. Notice the student organizations in colleges, and increasingly even in high schools, certainly in law schools, an alphabet soup of race, ethnicity, and identity. In law schools, we have BALSA, Black Students, Law Students Association, joined by SALSA, South American and Latino Students Organization, and APALSA, Asian and Pacific American, and winning the award for cleverness and for bucking the trend of initials outlaw for out gay and lesbian law students. If there's a plot to repress group differences, it has numerous and powerful enemies in the media, industry, politics, and in higher education. So these descriptions of group difference, I'll argue, are inevitably exercises of power. Now, I want to know, power isn't bad in this, but it is, power is not necessarily bad. We all exercise it. I'm exercising it right now as you sit here listening to me. It's not a claim that power is bad, but let's face it, they're exercises of power. They're attempts to legitimate a particular and controversial account of group culture over the objection of those who would reject or challenge that account. The idea that minorities should hew to their cultural traditions is arguably now as hegemonic as the idea that they should assimilate to some mythical milquetoast mainstream. And a right to cultural difference then would not leave people free from repression. Instead, it would install a specific set of ideas about what it means to be a member of whatever group the right protects. The normative component of the repressive hypothesis is, in this important sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy passing in the drag of a simple empirical observation. And perhaps worst of all, what passes for an objective description of group difference is all too often nothing better than a common stereotype. I realize these ideas require some elaboration, and I'd like to offer a few examples designed to provide it. At the time of the congressional hearings to confirm Clarence Thomas to the nomination of the Supreme Court, many of you may remember Clarence Thomas appeared to be sailing toward his associate justiceship when a woman named Anita Hill turned up inside the Beltway and made some rather nasty accusations. At that time, as the news was hitting the fan, sociologist Orlando Patterson wrote a newspaper op-ed column that claimed the following, that Anita Hill's reaction to Thomas's alleged sexual overtures was, I quote, unfair and disingenuous. Why? Because although the comments were, again, quote, completely out of the cultural frame of Thomas's white upper-middle-class work world, they were immediately recognizable to Hill and most other black women of working-class backgrounds. According to Patterson, Hill perfectly understood the psychocultural context in which Thomas allegedly regaled her with his Rabelaisian humor as a way of affirming their common origins. How nice. I'm concerned about the women who might have to endure such Rabelaisian bon mots, but I'm particularly concerned about black women who are implicated in this description of black culture. Patterson says explicitly that the description applies to nearly all African Americans. And so Patterson's account of racial culture necessarily discredits not only Anita Hill, but any other black person who objects to or disclaims Thomas's alleged behavior. And not only is Hill told that she must forbear Thomas's behavior because it's his culture, she's also told she must embrace it because it's her culture as well. In fact, not only is she told that she should embrace the raunchy esprit de corps that Thomas allegedly offered, she's told that she does embrace it, that she perfectly understands it, and that her objections to it and disclaimers of it are therefore disingenuous. The Patterson editorial demonstrates how easily questionable or even insulting ideas about the culture of a social subgroup might circulate. Of course, a newspaper editorial is not the same as a published judicial opinion, and a social commentator doesn't write with the authority of a federal judge. But the op-ed page of a mainstream American newspaper is a fairly good barometer of middle brow to elite public opinion. If Patterson's ideas about black culture got onto the op-ed page, they would almost certainly convince at least some judges. Ask not for whom the gavel strikes, it strikes for thee. Second example, one with which I imagine most of you will be at least somewhat familiar. Most of you probably know that, partly as a result of legal challenges, universities must justify any form of affirmative action in terms of diversity. And even if you didn't know about the lawsuits, you'd know about the diversity rationale from listening to the speeches of university administrators and reading the admissions literature. It's hard to go to a university and not hear something about diversity. And in this context, it's easy to forget that diversity, one, is only one of many potential rationales for affirmative action. It was not the main rationale for affirmative action policies when they were first adopted by universities in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and I'll argue it's not the best rationale for those policies today. Instead, diversity, the peculiar idea of racial difference as a type of cultural difference, was promoted from one of many ideas about racial salience to a centrality it did not merit because of a Supreme Court opinion in a case called UC Regents versus Allen Bakke, decided in 1978. So the diversity idea is an example of this notion of racial culture, and I want to argue that this idea about affirmative action was in some significant ways foisted on progressives by the Supreme Court, particularly by one Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell. It's common now to talk about both racial integration and racial difference, race relations in terms of diversity. Diversity's just become kind of a catch-all for talking about race. But I'd argue this owes almost entirely to the opinion of one man, Justice Lewis Powell of the Supreme Court. So the history of the diversity idea is an example of the effects of the multiculturalist idea that race is a type of cultural difference that I've been describing. Okay, Bakke. Alan Bakke applied to and was denied admission to the University of California Davis Medical School. He discovered that racial minorities with lower grades and test scores than his were admitted under an affirmative action program. Bakke sued the university, asserting that his 14th Amendment rights to equal protection had been violated, and Bakke won. Justice Powell, not writing for the court, but writing a separate opinion in a 4-1-4 split. This is sort of interesting. It turns out Powell's opinion is considered controlling because it split the difference between 4 on one side and 4 on the other. So this is one guy. Powell found 3 things. 1, rigid numerical quotas could never survive constitutional scrutiny applied to racial classification. So no quotas. 2, the governmental purpose of remedying past discrimination was sufficiently compelling to justify affirmative action and survive strict scrutiny only if the university endeavored to rectify and could identify specific instances of discrimination. And there was a strong implication that those the institution had to be remedying its own past discrimination. So that was effectively out as a rationale. The university could not justify affirmative action based on the rationale that it was remedying societal discrimination in general. Justice Powell instead wrote that that was too amorphous to count as a compelling rationale. But finally, there's a ray of hope for supporters of affirmative action, because a non-quota-based affirmative action plan would survive constitutional scrutiny if it was designed to promote diversity. The Bakke opinion was roundly condemned by progressives at the time, but it didn't take long for affirmative action's proponents, faced with the alternatives of risking the continued viability of the policy on another round of constitutional litigation, to embrace the Bakke diversity rationale like a life preserver. But it's worthwhile to remember that diversity was something that was imposed on us by a Supreme Court, and it's only after decades of affirmative action backlash, where diversity was the only thing left, that it looked progressive. Before Bakke, diversity was one of many rationales selective universities had to justify affirmative action. So for instance, a 1979 publication of the Stanford Medical School cited the need to remedy 1, societal discrimination, now unacceptable under Bakke. Here I quote, "The medical college admissions test may be inaccurate in indicating the basic ability and motivation of a minority student who's been subjected to social barriers. No specific instance, societal discrimination." 2, the chairman of the medical school search committee reported that the school sought to increase minority enrollment in order to better serve underserved minority communities, also an unacceptable rationale post-Bakke. And here a quote, "The health problems of the ghetto have become serious. We know from past experience that the typical medical student has failed to meet the challenge. We need minority enrollment to increase the number of black and brown physicians serving those communities, not just to integrate Stanford with minority students." That's also out. But before these were the prominent rationales. That's what I want to emphasize. Diversity wasn't even mentioned in these publications. These were the reasons universities were engaging in affirmative action, and they said so until Bakke. Then they had to change their tune. Now, 25 years after Bakke, as I'm sure you know, the Supreme Court reaffixed its by then faded imprimatur to diversity, and only diversity, in a case called Grutter versus Bollinger, involving admissions at the University of Michigan Law School. O'Connor's opinion in Grutter exacerbates many of the troubling effects of Bakke, and it unambiguously installs diversity, and only diversity, as the sole permissible rationale for affirmative action. She goes even further, in fact, than Justice Powell did in Bakke in discrediting the other potential rationales. So, it's clear what you need to do if you're a university with an affirmative action program. You better say you're doing it for the sake of diversity and only diversity. It's diversity uber alles. Grutter also gives explicit marching orders, though, to applicants as well as selective universities. So O'Connor in Grutter says, all applicants have the opportunity to highlight their own diversity contributions through the submission of a personal statement, letters of recommendation, and an essay describing the ways in which the applicant will contribute to diversity. Bakke's codification, then, of the diversity rationale pushed institutions that wished to engage in affirmative action and members of minority groups themselves to emphasize cultural difference. Only by highlighting stark differences in perspectives, norms, experiences marked by race could universities justify affirmative action post-Bakke. The other rationales are out the window. And worst of all, a more subtle and more pernicious implication hovered over post-Bakke university life. Only by highlighting their own cultural distinctiveness could minority students justify their presence in the universities that had admitted or might admit them. Students don't have to read Supreme Court opinions to get the diversity message. For instance, the Kaplan Test graduate school admissions advisor nudges the applicant who may not have gotten the memo. Does your ethnic or cultural perspective give you a different take on the world? It asks. Similarly, Kaplan's Get Into Law School, a strategic approach, promises on its cover insider advice from top admissions officers and then instructs the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that race can be a factor in striving for a diverse student body. Therefore, if you participated in a minority students organization, list it on your application. If there's something unique or of special interest regards your race, as regards your race or ethnicity, include it in your personal statement. And these instructions weren't lost on applicants to selective universities and professional schools. Most admissions officers know this already, as do faculty who review admissions applications. One such person, on condition of anonymity, referred to a veritable genre of cooking smells admissions essays, in which the applicant waxed nostalgic about the heartwarming aroma of some distant relative's ethnic cooking. But you don't have to accept anecdotes. Consider these real-life excerpts from personal statements penned by successful applicants to Harvard Law School in the book aptly titled How to Get Into Harvard Law School. I quote, "My primary motivation for receiving a law degree surfaces from my personal experience with the struggles of the Latin American immigrant. My experience with other cultures gives me sensitivity to the voices of today's international America." Another one, when I supported funding for the Carolina Gay and Lesbian Association, my curiosity about foreign cultures began early. As the child of Paraguayan immigrants, I too occupy a borderland. I studied American Sign Language and was introduced to deaf culture. By the time I entered college, I had mastered the language of 3 communities: the Paraguayan Spanish spoke by my mother at home, the profanity-laden slang of our poor, all-black Washington, D.C. neighborhood, and the textbook English enforced in the private schools I attended. I'm a 4th-generation Mexican-American with Cajun ancestry. As an expatriate, I had developed a keen awareness of cultural diversity by actually being a part of different cultures. I want to get involved with law to preserve a state wealthy in culture and diversity, and winning the prize for directness. If accepted, I will bring to Harvard Law School a very rich and diverse cultural background. Not much in the way of specifics, but she gets the idea, or he gets the idea. No doubt, some of these narratives are heartfelt, but it's hard to escape the conclusion that at least some of them are strategic. Designed to improve the applicant's chance of admission to a selected college or university. So, pace Foucault. We have the production of culture. Diversity has influenced personal statements, making them in many ways less diverse. Imagine what some of these bright and interesting young people might have revealed about themselves had they not been encouraged to play up cultural difference in order to conform to a predictable and stereotypical idea of diversity. And diversity rhetoric must also affect the sincere self-conception of some applicants, but this isn't necessarily good. They may think, if this is what the college values about me, maybe this is what's truly valuable about me. And such students might also be influenced by questionable academic literature about race and cultural difference, some of which, if we didn't know better, would sound like a conventional racial stereotype. One book, entitled Black Children, Their Roots, Culture, and Learning Styles, identifies these, what the author claims, as distinctively black cultural traits. Afro-American people tend to prefer inferential reasoning to deductive or inductive reasoning. So much for philosophers. Afro-American people tend to approximate space, numbers, and time rather than stick to accuracy. So much for black engineers. Afro-American people tend not to be very word-dependent. They tend, instead, to be proficient in nonverbal communications. Black people think in terms of approximation of time rather than punctuality. Meetings that begin in what's called colored people's time, according to the author, usually begin about 20 minutes after the appointed time. Such unsubstantiated popular hypotheses about racial difference, plausible precisely because they echo familiar racial stereotypes perpetuated for centuries by racists, can easily become a comfortable rationalization for various types of less than socially beneficial and less than individually beneficial behavior. And there's another cost to the diversity rationale that I want to focus on briefly. I mentioned before one of the costs was that the racial culture idea distracted our attention from larger and arguably more important issues of racial justice. So let's think about Bakke and Grutter again in the diversity rationale. Bakke and Grutter both push diversity to the exclusion of any other conception of racial salience. The opinions are quite clear. If you care about race as a university, the only reason you're entitled to care about it is diversity. They reject one of the most important justifications for affirmative action in professional school admissions before Bakke, the expectation that minority graduates are more likely to serve underserved communities. They exclude the idea that racial identity entails an ongoing and contemporary relationship to a patterned and predictable form of social bias and discrimination, which may detrimentally affect the grades and test scores that selective universities rely on to sort applicants for admission. Both opinions reject this idea as the unacceptably amorphous idea of societal discrimination. So universities can't talk about that. As a result, post-Bakke universities want to know all about the unique culture of the ancestors of their minority applicants, but they ignore the potential discrimination suffered by the applicants themselves. Diversity allows that the enslavement of a black applicant's great-grandfather or great-grandmother is relevant to her application, but implies that the racism she may have suffered herself at the hands of a high school teacher or administrator a few years or months ago is not. Interestingly enough, even in Grutter, there's a shadow rationale. After all this, 32 pages or so, nothing but diversity. The Grutter opinion notes in passing, and it's just one clause, it's not even an entire sentence. By virtue of our nation's struggle with racial inequality, minority students are both likely to have experiences of particular importance to the law school's mission and less likely to be admitted in meaningful numbers on criterion that ignore those experiences. That's the sentence. Now let's parse it out. The first clause is a restatement of the diversity idea, but the second one, less likely to be admitted in meaningful numbers, is the only place in the entire Grutter opinion where the court recognizes what is essential to understanding affirmative action. That racial inequality is the reason that fewer minority students will be admitted without affirmative action. That sounds an awful lot to me like a recognition that societal discrimination is a valid justification for affirmative action after all. And it's interesting that O'Connor just couldn't quite get through the opinion without admitting it for a split second. This remedial rationale, based on a frank acknowledgement of the persistence of racism, need not suggest that minority students must exhibit racial difference in recognizable form in order to merit admission. The alternative rationale, less than one sentence, one clause buried in 32 pages extolling diversity and only diversity, offers a compelling justification for affirmative action, one that offers a more dignified portal of entry to minority students than diversity alone, and one which undoubtedly comes closer to accurately describing the sincere motivations of selective universities and professional schools than does cultural diversity alone. Yet the prospects of anyone openly acknowledging the shadow rationale are dim indeed, because the Bakke and Grutter courts rejected the remedial rationale in the context of societal discrimination. To do so would be to invite a lawsuit. In this light, it would appear that a central function of the diversity rhetoric is to finesse, if not obscure, the salience of contemporary racism. Diversity is popular with college administrators, student activists, corporate executives, and civil rights lawyers, the Congressional Black Caucus, and leaders of the Republican Party alike, because it hints at racism, mollifying the activist, without being so impolitic as to actually name it. Diversity eschews a blunt assessment of the effects of bigotry in favor of a conversation about culture, something that we can all have at cocktail parties. And by describing status hierarchy as a problem of intrinsic difference, diversity discourse transforms what should be an indictment of social practices of subordination into a hopeful plea for tolerance. This can't be good for race relations, either on diverse college campuses or in a diverse and tragically all too often still racially divided society. And I don't think it puts too fine a point on it to insist that the diversity rationale required colleges and universities to adopt a specific and by no means obvious view of race relations. The very institutions then charged with promoting public intellectual discourse universities and colleges were effectively required to adopt a party line about a very contentious question of race relations, either that or face legal liability for their efforts to achieve integration. A few points in conclusion. You can favor some of the policy outcomes advanced by the legal multiculturalist and still object to the means they've chosen to arrive at them. So, for instance, I tend to favor more autonomy for employees in terms of their dress and grooming. I think there are difficult questions here that require us to balance the needs of employers against the autonomy concerns of employees. It's possible that current law does this as well as it can be done. And it's also possible, though, that we could do better by giving all employees, regardless of race or cultural affiliation, expressive rights to grooming autonomy. This is a discussion that may be worth having, but putting it in terms of culture, as Renee Rogers and her defenders did, adds only confusion and dogmatism to the analysis we'd need to engage. Similarly, as I imagine you can tell, I'm in favor of affirmative action. I think it's a sensible policy of racial integration, and it's sensible as a remedial policy to confront existent, existent societal discrimination that many minority students may face. But I think the exclusive focus on cultural diversity has done damage for the reasons I've suggested. Most of all, I worry that the race as culture idea that percolates through all of these examples keeps people of different races apart and shuts down needed dialogue. We have a long way to go toward racial justice in this nation, although we've come a long way. And the predominance of the idea of race as cultural difference is, I think, in the way of progress. It suggests that people can't understand each other's experiences. It suggests that certain people are just disqualified from opining on issues of race. And I don't think that's going to get us very far. If this idea were put on hiatus, this race as culture idea, we might have more frequent and more meaningful relationships between people of different races and ethnicities. And maybe we'd find it easier to connect across the canonical identity categories because we'd be open to finding and building commonalities rather than seeing shared institutions, values, and norms as mechanism of something like cultural genocide. Such affinities, I think, would go a long way toward establishing the trust and social capital that will be necessary in order to achieve greater social justice in terms of race and in other issues. Thank you. Sure. Yeah, if we have time, I'd love to. Yes?
Two-part question. Do you think that groups based on identities such as race, culture, age, whatever, prevent the spreading of acceptance of those different groups by secularizing them? And if so or if not, do you think it's possible to still have those groups, to still have mutually accepting larger collective?
As to the latter question, I hope so. I don't want to say that I think the very idea that these groups exist is the impediment. I think it's obvious that we live in a society which, for social reasons, is divided along lines of race and along lines of gender and along other lines. And it wouldn't be useful to deny that and deny their salience. But I do think once we've recognized that, the problem is going further and insisting that a lot of things come along with those identities. I'd like to see us have a conception of race as something that's ascribed. What we know for sure is that we live in a society in which people can recognize various racial groups and they know right away. No one here would have trouble identifying my race. No one in this room, I venture to say. Now that's ascription. You don't need to know anything else about me, and you don't need to accept a stereotype or an anthropological conception about me in order to understand that. So I don't think that the identities have to be in the way of greater commonalities. I think right now they are, in part because people are too often we're committed to the idea that the identities come along with a lot in terms of culture and actually come along with obligations to avoid meaningful contact with people of other groups. Yes?
Can you comment, I guess give an opinion about what you think of the admissions policy
other room who aren't hearing the
Oh, sure.
audience in here? Thank
So the
you.
question was, what do I think of kind of alternatives to race-based affirmative action programs that take a percentage of high school graduates, like the top 10%. I think often it's referred to as the Texas 10% plan because it was developed there. What do I think about those as an alternative? Do I think they're a good approach? Well, I think it depends. The Texas 10% plan, as I understand it, had mixed successes in achieving what the proponents wanted it to achieve. It's kind of an interesting and I guess odd idea that it would be okay to use a deliberate proxy for race, but it wouldn't be okay to just go ahead and consider race itself. So if the idea of the 10% plan is that we'll actually get race diversity, but we won't be going after it directly, I guess I don't see the point, except in terms of symbolism. Another thing to say about the Texas 10% plan is it wouldn't work in a lot of places. I mean, for instance, the idea that you take the top 10% of high school graduates in California and admit them all to the University of California system would overload the system several times over. It's just too big a state. So it depends a lot on demographics. And one last thing about the Texas 10% plan, one of the facts about Texas, and it's true in a lot of other states, but more in Texas than some, is the 10% plan was going to work in order to produce racial integration because the schools were so segregated. You could be sure that the top 10% of X one school district, the school district's 100% Latino, so the top 10% you're going to get a lot of Latinos. It's kind of too bad to have a system that's premised on such severe segregation at the high school level. So those are some drawbacks. I mean, I don't want to condemn the idea outright, and I think there may be good reasons to do it, something like the 10% plan, that don't have much to do with race, for class integration, for instance, which is also an important goal. But I do have those questions. Yes?
Yes, it's my impression, mistaken or not, that these two important decisions are to reconcile equality of opportunity with affirmative action. And I wonder if those are reconcilable goals or not.
That's a very big question. So the question was, the Supreme Court opinions were attempts to reconcile equality of opportunity with affirmative action, and you're asking whether it's possible to reconcile those two goals. Well, I mean, I think it's a very complicated question. If we think that equality of opportunity means people are admitted based on the numerical indicia, in other words, grades and test scores, then affirmative action is inconsistent with that. It's an attempt to depart from that. I'm not convinced that equality of opportunity means everyone's admitted on the basis of grades and test scores. It certainly hasn't always been the way elite universities have gone about doing their admissions policies. The focus on grades and test scores is relatively recent. My understanding is it's really started in the 1960s and 70s. And there, even then, there are lots of exceptions. So I think the two are compatible if one has a different conception of what counts as equality of opportunity. But of course, any admissions program in a selective university, by definition, is going to discriminate. It's going to weed out some people, and in that sense, maybe that kind of selectivity is in and of itself inconsistent with equality of opportunity in one definition.
Another dividing line here is public and private.
Yes.
Obviously.
No, that's right. Although that dividing line is not as sharp as some might think, because under the title, I believe it's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, would apply the constitutional standard applied to public universities to private ones that receive federal funding, which is almost all of them. So in fact, very quickly we know that whatever standards applied to the public universities is almost certainly going to be applied to the private ones. And the private universities are well aware of this and watch these cases just as ardently as the public ones.
I was a little bit concerned in the first part of your talk that the argument traded an awful lot on this notion of essentialism. I sometimes felt as if what you were saying is that the relationship between culture and identity can only be important if it's an essential one. And since it's not an essential one, none of the examples you gave have any essential relationship to a particular group. Therefore, therefore it can't be important. But that sequence of thoughts, and in particular the notion that there's some essential connection, just strikes me as deeply questionable. Why isn't it enough to say that when we look at the history of oppression, what we see is that one of the first things that any oppressor does is take away the cultural resources of a people as a means of disempowering them. When the British took away the Catholicism of the Irish and took away Gaelic, it was not because there's any essential connection between being Irish and being Catholic. It was because these were the resources that were used to empower people. And the problem with the cornrow example is it strikes me it kind of trivializes the importance of that connection.
Well, this is a big question as well. To repeat for the people in the other room, basically I'm sorry, so I'm going to have to put it in a nutshell. But the question was whether or not I was unduly focusing on essentialism, did the argument hinge on the assertion that the cultural practices don't have an essential connection to the racial identity. And I would like to say I don't think that that's not what I was arguing. That's not what I was arguing. What I'm saying is that the proponents of this idea very often argue that the cultural practices are essential to the identity. So the essentialism is coming from the idea I'm critiquing, not from me. Now, your second point is, again, another big question and quite, very interesting. The most I can say about that is, although it may be true that in some instances oppressors or colonizers use as a mechanism of oppression depriving the oppressed group of some set of distinctive cultural practices, what you described as their cultural resources, that's not always true. Sometimes the oppressive group does that by what I'd call the production of difference. I mean, late apartheid South Africa is an obvious example of this, where the strategy of the apartheid regime in South Africa after, I think, about 1954 was definitely not to try to deprive the various African tribes of their cultural traditions. Rather, it was to impose them on them. It was to set up this, supposedly distinctive, authentic tribal governments and and claim through the strategy of separate development that because each of these groups had its own separate culture, they needed to be segregated and have their own separate Bantustan. So it's also possible for oppression to work in the other direction. Last thing, it seems to me that in the context that I was discussing, African Americans in the United States, and in many other contexts as well, I think, the relationship between the cultural practice that's asserted at a particular moment and its historical importance to the group is often somewhat obscure. That very often practices are described as existing time immemorial, not necessarily essential, but existing in our group from time immemorial, one of our cultural resources, when in fact the practice is of a relatively recent origin and therefore serving some other function. And the cornrow example may be an example of that. Renee Rogers asserted in her own briefs that the style was popularized in the 70s. The claim that I'm making there is not that, it's not essential to the racial group and therefore your claim is no good, but that we can question a lot of the reasons that she thinks we should tie the style to African Americans at all, that there's any weight to that connection by interrogating the claim. And then we may think that the style is doing some other work that we'd have to ask questions about. I think, Keith, you had your hand.
Thanks for a great talk, Rich. I was going to ask you a question about what some of the consequences of your critique that you see in terms of party politics in the U.S. or on the international level. And the reason here I'm talking about is, while you're critical, I think properly so, of essentialism, I was going to say, on some senses, the kind of gross characterizations of, say, demographic groups and voting trends, say, within the United States, tends to describe certain kinds of characteristics of that. And I was just wondering how your critique would apply that. On the international level, there's some debates going on over the protection of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge going on, and I was just wondering what you would think of, say, the essentializing trends that might be going on in international bodies that are attempting to say, well, because this is indigenous knowledge, we have to protect it, and in some ways the protection might be considered by some critics as a disservice to the kind of dynamism of the community. question is about politically, how do you see this playing out?
Right, no, that's great. So the two questions, one of them seemed, if I understood it correctly, had to do with electoral reapportionment, where the claim of critics of race-conscious redistricting practices is that they assume a connection between race and political affiliation that's not warranted. So what do my ideas have to say about that? And the second one had to do with cultural, the protection of, I guess, cultural intellectual property of indigenous peoples around the world, and how would I see it playing out in those contexts. You're both complicated. In the context of voting, I'd say, we have an empirical analysis that we could perform. It seems to be that in the states of the former Confederacy, one can make a pretty good case that race and political affiliation do go together. And it doesn't require you to make an elaborate argument about the cultural entailments of racial identity. It simply requires you to notice something about our relatively recent national history. So that strikes me to be good enough in the context of electoral reapportionment. Now, there are complicated questions here. There are a lot of people that argue that, the biggest beneficiaries of race-conscious redistricting are the Republican Party. And there are reasons to think that if we got, if the Voting Rights Act weren't renewed in a couple of years, it would be the Democrats. Also, traditionally, now the party that supports, or that African Americans support, that would benefit. But I do think you can make the case for race-conscious redistricting without the kind of cultural arguments I'm making, or I'm critiquing here. In terms of indigenous intellectual property, it's a huge question. It strikes me, there's some really interesting things to be said about the way these ideas of cultural difference have circulated at the international level and become sort of institutionalized. So although the people advancing cultural difference ideas consistently paint themselves as the downtrodden underdog, in fact, they're increasingly taking control of some fairly powerful international institutions in some contexts. They're not without power. It seems to me, and this is just a first cut at an issue about which I know relatively little. I know you know more, for instance, that a lot of what's at stake in these questions is really has to do fundamentally with the redistribution of wealth from first to third world, from powerful metropolitan economies that have historically colonized a lot of these people and those people, and that kind of redistribution, if it's achieved, if the only way to achieve it is through these kind of cultural protection of indigenous property mechanisms, maybe that's maybe I'd support that. But I do imagine that if I looked closely at some of these cases, I'd see room for some similar objections. That's my guess without having a lot more information. Yes.
The University of California system is the California prison system.
Yes.
In your state, according to a 60 Minutes report a couple of weeks ago, the Hispanic, white, and black populations must be very rigidly segregated from each other, because if they were to mix in the dining facilities or the sleeping quarters, they would kill each other. What can you tell us about, what are your thoughts about that kind of a system?
That's a very big question. Yeah, I think when I talk about race relations, I say that if there are two issues that I would focus on as the most severe racial injustices in the United States, one of them is neighborhood segregation or ghettoization, and the other one's the prison system or the criminal justice system. So, in my view, the racial implications of almost every aspect of the criminal justice system are so disturbing and so dire. And what you've just described is the ultimate culmination of a system that's badly broken in terms of racial justice in a lot of ways, that we get to the point where when these people are imprisoned, you either racially segregate them or you have race wars going on in the prisons. It says a lot about what we need to do to make prisons more humane, and I think it probably says a lot about the problem of an approach to social control that entails just quarantining huge numbers of young men for most of their lives. if not all of their lives. So I'm afraid I don't have more, more to say about it than that. I can't see my way through a solution when you're just focusing on San Quentin. It seems to me that the solution's got to involve fixing the whole broken system. Yes.
I need to qualify that, and I hope you won't mind, but the 60-minute segment was about the racial gangs in particular, not just the population of the prisons. And those gangs, all three, they were talking about the white supremacists and the black and the Latino gangs. They're ready to eat each other up. But that's a big difference, I think, than just talking about the general prison population.
I'm not sure how to respond. I mean, the gangs are in the prisons, right, as well as outside. So
it was a segment on how the gangs are in the prisons and how they have to deal with the gangs in the prisons, because they are potentially in control of the prisons and would literally eat each other alive.
Right.
And I felt I had to qualify that because the question was about the prison population. And if you don't talk about, the question specifically in terms of things, I don't think the question is quite valid.
Thank you. I agree.
Okay. So did I think I did, was my answer still adequate? I just wanted to make sure that I didn't miss something else. Okay, yes.
I was just wondering what your take on the whole immigration issues and protests and pending legislation.
Oh, wow. So, right. I mean, that's fascinating. In fact, just today in the airport on the way to this lecture, I saw a CNN segment where an African-American minister was complaining that the people rallying for immigration rights held up placards that said, "We have a dream too," or something along those lines, evoking Martin Luther King, and he was very angry about this and thought that it was a misuse of King's legacy. I think that this is, wow, there are a lot of parallels between the situation of blacks during the Jim Crow era and post-Reconstruction and migrant immigrants today. I mean, the sharecropping system in the Deep South and what happens to migrant farm workers, for instance, in California, look an awful lot alike. So it strikes me that the analogy is fair, at least on those grounds. Now, I'd offer one qualification. It does seem to me that there are legitimate questions to be asked about how a nation structures its immigration policy, and people who ask such questions aren't necessarily racists. So the worry I have about evoking that kind of rhetoric is that someone who wants to raise questions about what we should do about immigration and perhaps isn't convinced that amnesty is the right approach, would be labeled a racist, or this idea would suggest that they're a bigot, they're the equivalent of Bull Connor, or someone opposing civil rights legislation. And I don't think that's right. My own view is that that we need to have some kind of normalization of the legal status of people who are in the United States doing important and valuable work and are really part of these communities. I don't. But I do think there's room for legitimate debate about exactly how we go about that. Yes.
If we admit the sort of intellectual honesty of your argument, and that sort of the diversity argument is kind of this red herring, because but it's the only one the Supreme Court has left us. So my question is, what's a university to do? Do we continue? Do we sort of say, you're right, this is not really the justification, so forget it, we're not going to do this stuff anymore? Or do we say, we have a large discussion about diversity to distract the Supreme Court from what it is we're actually doing?
Or maybe not even, given O'Connor's opinion, one almost thinks, this is the smart woman. She knows to some extent that diversity isn't the only rationale that's driving these policies. I think, if I were a university admissions officer, I'd probably do exactly what they're doing. It does strike me as unfortunate, though, and and the costs of the exclusive reliance on the diversity rationale, I think, have to be reckoned with. One might decide, and I imagine I probably would decide that the cost is worth paying, but the Grutter opinion's not cause for celebration. It's the lesser of evils, and I think that's about the best you can say about it. Yes.
Certain organizations, even though they want to, because it's supposed to, he's black. And my daughter being told that, that when she said that she didn't even think about race all the time, and race is something that said that blacks think about race all the time, and she do her job in bed, she says, oh, opposite thing, and she says, no, I don't feel that way. That's not what happens in our family. And Shaka told her she was in denial.
Great. Thanks for your comments. Yeah, I think that's exactly the kind of thing I'm worried about, and you do see it. In one sense, we could say, of course, people of color and children of color especially need to be aware that we live in a society where there's racism and that they may confront it sometimes. They need to be prepared for that. And no one would want their kids to go in the world naive. But when they're told something like what your children were told, if you don't think about race all the time, you're in denial, gosh, it seems to be that we're actually producing racial injuries. That now every time someone, if this message sinks in, every time she goes somewhere, she'll think, oh, well, maybe it's racism. Anytime the cab passes me in Manhattan, but it's racism. Well, sometimes it's racism, but a lot of times it's that the cab was busy, or it was they were changing shifts or something else. It seems there's a lot of psychological damage that we do to people by convincing them to see racism in everything, and it's really unfortunate, especially with kids.
On that harmonious note, speaker.
Thank you.
And I want to remind you about the reception and the book signing, and Professor Ford, I'm sure, will be happy to address more of your questions informally. Thanks for coming.